Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. This past week in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 31 members of the group The Popular Front were arrested by law enforcement authorities with plans to violently disrupt a gay pride demonstration that was scheduled as part of Gay Pride Month. Many of the members were alleged by law enforcement sources to have firearms as well as blunt force weapons with the intent of doing great violence. About a month prior in Buffalo, New York, an armed gunman killed 10 people in what appeared to be a racially motivated attack, which could reasonably be described as an incident of domestic terrorism. In Volume 5, Issue 2 of Horns of a Dilemma, Barbara McQuade, a former U.S. prosecutor, speaks about the issue of domestic terrorism and specifically takes a look at the Biden administration's strategy for domestic terrorism. We're privileged to have Ms. McQuade join us now, and would you please introduce yourself?
Sure, Doyle. I'm Barb McQuade. I am a washed-up former federal prosecutor who found refuge at my alma mater, the University of Michigan Law School, where I teach as a professor from practice, and I'm delighted to be with you today.
Excellent. Could you please start out by telling us a little bit about the Biden administration strategy? I understand it has 4 pillars, correct?
Yeah, and first of all, it's noteworthy the mere fact that they have a strategy for domestic terrorism and fighting domestic violent extremism. In years past, I think we have focused so much on international terrorism that we've lost sight of the very real danger from within. So I think it's terrific that they're focusing on it and that they've got people in government who are focusing on this issue. So the 4 pillars, as you said, one is about just enhancing research and analysis, really important. We've spent a lot of effort studying international terrorism and just studying what the risk is, what the threat is really important. The second is to work on prevention resources and services by, building resilience of people who might be targeted by terrorist organizations, mental health and other things like that. So important second step. The third pillar is to disrupt and deter domestic terrorism activity. In international terrorism, for years, the FBI has been focused on this concept of left of boom. That is not just addressing a terrorism incident by prosecuting it after the fact, after people are dead and property is damaged, but to deter and prevent it before it occurs. And they refer to that as left of boom because if you can imagine a timeline, boom is the attack, the moment of violence. Left of boom is anything on that timeline before the attack. And so focusing domestic terrorism strategies left of boom is an important part of that. And then finally, to confront the long-term contributors of domestic violence, gun violence, racism, unaddressed mental health, economic disparities. All of these things make people more vulnerable when they hear the siren song of others saying, there are people out there taking what's rightfully yours. You should rise up and fight them. And so addressing some of those underlying disparities is an important part of it too. So four pillar strategy, and it's a good start.
So as you point out in the article, these are terrific pillars, and they seem like the sort of thing that people could gather behind. But of course, we do run into some complications, and foremost among them are the First and Fourth Amendments to the United States Constitution. So what are some of the civil rights and civil liberty issues that come into tension as we start taking a look at the question of defining, prosecuting, disrupting domestic terrorism?
Yeah, and this is where, we have this balance in our country. On the one hand, we want to protect public safety. On the other, we have civil liberties that we hold dear and we do not want to compromise. And so we need to be thoughtful in thinking about how we want to go about this. But as you say, First Amendment protects our rights to free speech. So saying things on social media and in the public square is protected. There are also rights to free assembly, which has been interpreted by the court as free association. So we're allowed to hang out with whoever we want to hang out with and gather with people. If we like to join people together in a club that likes to drink and shoot things, we have the right to do that. And so that right of free association comes into tension when we want to regulate these paramilitary groups that call themselves militias. There are Second Amendment rights that permit us to bear arms, and yet we have groups that are training with assault weapons in a way that I believe endangers the American public. The Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable searches and seizures does create challenges when it comes to conducting surveillance on groups. And, these are not just academic concerns. They're very real concerns. We saw abuses by the FBI in the 1960s and 70s in the name of national security. We saw them use some very abusive tactics to go after civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King and Vietnam War protesters, doing things like conducting warrantless surveillance and going undercover and doing activities to disrupt peaceful protests. And so we certainly don't want to return to those tactics. And yet, when we think about the corrective actions that were taken in the 70s and beyond, there is always the concern, and I share it, that perhaps the pendulum has gone too far in the other direction. And by allowing all of this activity to occur without any meaningful investigation, we have allowed that line between public safety and liberty to perhaps swing too far in the other direction.
So a lot of analysts identify four main groups of domestic terrorism. You have anti-government groups where the militias, I think, would reside. You have white supremacist groups. You have anti-abortion groups, and you have environmental and animal rights groups. And of those four, three are associated on the far side of the political spectrum with the political right. And so I'm curious whether the First Amendment questions about freedom of expression and assembly assume an even greater salience and difficulty when we're dealing with an issue that seems to be more closely associated with one side of the political spectrum than the other.
I think it does. I think it creates some practical realities politically that can be challenged. Of course, in the 60s and 70s, the groups that were in the crosshairs were groups on the left, civil rights protesters, anti-war protesters. And now we see these groups, as you say, anti-government groups, anti-abortion groups, racist groups, white supremacist groups being affiliated with the right. But what, the FBI should do in a perfect world is to focus not so much on political party or political viewpoint, but on conduct. And that's where the investigative activity should be. People in the FBI don't, or at least shouldn't, care about anyone's political perspective, but our society has become so politically polarized that whenever you begin to investigate any group that has a political affiliation, there will be this outcry that you just want to stop me because I'm advancing a political agenda that's different from the party in power. And I think one of the things that, because of our hyper-politicized world, I have found that it's sometimes difficult to explain to people what it means to be apolitical. There are a lot of people who just don't understand it, for whom it just does not compute. But I spent my career in the Justice Department investigating members who were, individuals who were completely apolitical or those who were political of both parties, because the focus isn't on the message that they're trying to convey, but the conduct, the dangerous, violent conduct that they're engaging in. And I think we have to have the courage to be willing to withstand those political attacks. You're only going after me because of politics. No, I'm not. I'm going after you because of your conduct. Move on. I investigated Republicans and Democrats, and I got that kind of criticism. And you have to have thick enough skin to be able to withstand it and say, it's conduct, not viewpoint, that we're investigating.
So I'm curious, because one of the things that you identified in the article as something you would have liked to have seen called for in the strategy but was not there is a federal statute addressing domestic terrorism. And I'm curious how the combination of the civil liberties issues, which historically have been a very strong concern for the political left, and this identification of this activity with elements of the political right, including elements that seem to be associated with the base of support for the previous administration, how that augurs for the success of getting a federal domestic terrorism statute drafted and passed.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge because this is a proposal that's unpopular with both the left and the right, is what makes it so difficult. I also think that, Doyle, we live in a world where perhaps because of information overload, we hear so much and we get so bombarded by it, then when people hear about a domestic terrorism statute, they immediately equate it with all of the types of tools that we use in the international terrorism space. And people aren't advocating for identical tools, but I think we tend to paint in broad strokes because we're so bombarded with messages. And so there are certain kinds of domestic terrorism statutes that I think are non-starters. For example, in the international terrorism space, we have designated foreign terrorist organizations. And those organizations, it is illegal to provide them with any material support. And so in other words, no questions asked. I don't care why you might be giving money to groups on the list like Hamas or Hezbollah. It may be that you're giving money to Hezbollah for humanitarian reasons because your grandma lives in Lebanon near the border with Israel and her house keeps getting bombarded and you want to send money to Hezbollah because they help repair homes and they run hospitals. No good, because Hezbollah is a designated foreign terrorist organization. If you give money to Hezbollah, no matter what your motive, it is a crime because Hezbollah also engages in terrorism. And so we have made it a crime to simply provide any type of material support to them, any kinds of goods, money, services, because we recognize that those things are fungible. And even if you're giving to the hospital, that means other dollars are freed up to support their terrorist activities. And so we make that illegal. And we've made a policy decision that that's okay because those interests are not First Amendment protected, or if they are, these statutes are narrowly tailored to advance a compelling governmental interest. And so we've made contributions to those groups off limits. I don't think we could do something equivalent with domestic terrorism groups. I guess I shouldn't call them terrorism groups, domestic groups. If the Proud Boys exist because they are advancing what they call a male chauvinistic worldview, that's allowed. And to make it a crime to provide funds to that group, I think probably would run afoul of the First Amendment and is probably an area we just don't want to get too close to. But that doesn't mean that all domestic terrorism statutes should be off the books. And so we need to be really careful about what we're talking about. What I would propose is an equivalent to the crime of international terrorism, which means engaging in violent conduct dangerous to human life for the purpose of intimidating a civilian population or influencing a government through violent conduct, and that traverses an international boundary. That's the definition, the statutory definition, the gist of it for international terrorism. We have no domestic terrorism equivalent to that. There is a definition on the books that I think would work quite well, which is essentially acts of violence that endanger human life for those same purposes, intimidating a civilian population or influencing government policy. But it's only a definition. It's not a crime. And it's used as a definition because it allows certain investigative techniques by the FBI. It allows certain sentencing enhancements upon a conviction for other kinds of crimes. But the reason it matters as a crime, and I know people say, well, you can always investigate an act of terrorism after it happens by charging state murder charges. Absolutely true. But the reason it creates a gap in the law is that left of boom concept. What we really want is for the FBI to be able to begin proactive investigations before an attack occurs. And so there are certain crimes domestic crimes that count as terrorism. If you use a bomb, for example, like Timothy McVeigh did to blow up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, and you found out about his plot in advance, you could investigate that because there is a statute for weapons of mass destruction. But if instead it is a mass shooting, or if instead it is a vehicular homicide, there is not a federal statute that you could use to begin a left of boom investigation. And so I found myself involved in some of these kinds of cases. We had a militia group that was planning to attack police officers using guns. And so we had to charge seditious conspiracy there, which is a tough statute to prove because it requires using force against the authority of the United States government. I had another case where we were investigating a potential mass shooting, and we had difficulty opening a proactive investigation there because there was not a federal domestic terrorism statute. And so the state can investigate things as, potential murder plots. Some of them also have state terrorism statutes that they can use, but they tend to lack the resources to do these kinds of proactive investigations that can stop an attack left of boom. We had an international case several times, we were able to find out about the plot on social media by trolling around in the kinds of chat rooms where they support ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and then using an undercover officer to engage with that person to say, hey, brother, sounds interesting. Tell me more. And then once the person said, oh, what I'd really like to do is conduct an attack, but I lack the weapons. Anybody know where I can find some assault weapons? And then they could work together to set up a sting operation. There really isn't the space to do that in the domestic terrorism space. And so for that reason, I think having this very narrowly tailored domestic terrorism statute that builds on this one specific international terrorism statute, terrorism transcending international boundaries, to make it terrorism transcending state boundaries so that the FBI could get involved left of boom, I think would go a long way toward being very proactive. And we saw an example of this on January 6th when Christopher Wray testified after the fact about why the FBI wasn't more engaged in what they saw occurring before January 6th, when it seems like everyone else in America could see that there's a really dangerous plot afoot. They said, we can't just go in and troll around on social media and find this because we don't have an authorizing statute to open that kind of investigation. This would give them that kind of authorizing statute so that they could do that kind of left of boom proactive investigation.
So one of the other things that you call for in your article is a different modality of mental health interventions. And that strikes me as an interesting proposal for a couple of reasons. First of all, in almost every episode of mass gun violence, whether it is plausibly politically motivated or not, there seems to be a discussion, almost a deflection toward questions of mental health care without necessarily devoting resources to it. But then the other is the question of whether you further stigmatize mental health care by associating it with law enforcement intervention. And I guess I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts on how improved and different types of mental health intervention would assist with the domestic terrorism effort.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, again, is in our society of information overload, we tend to paint with broad brushes and we say, the person who committed this act of violent extremism had mental illness. Well, not all mental illness is created equal. Certainly there are plenty of people who deal with issues like depression and anxiety and other kinds of things who never engage in violence and who in fact are very withdrawn and are the least violent people in the world. And so I think we need to be careful to avoid stigmatizing all people with mental health, because what we really want is for people to come forward when they're struggling, in the same way people come forward when they've got a broken arm or a broken leg and say, I need help, and get them the help they need. Instead, this is a very precise kind of mental illness, and the Secret Service is already involved in its National Threat Assessment Center by using multidisciplinary threat assessment teams to assess the very precise kind of mental illness that is associated with acts of violence. And so I think we need to be, again, really careful in our vocabulary and in the way we intervene. But they do work with schools on having these teams of intervention teams, and they look for things like sudden withdrawal or isolation, erratic changes in behavior, the kinds of talk that we saw, for example, in Oxford, Michigan, just before a student allegedly shot up his school, where he was drawing pictures and really begging for help about how he was obsessed with guns and he was going to shoot up his school, and really begging for help. And it was ignored, at least by his parents who were involved in it, and perhaps by others who may have been able to see these warning signals. If the school instead had the kind of off-ramps that are there to help provide this kind of intervention, maybe we could have, stopped that kind of activity. And so can we have this kind of engagement in communities so that when people are demonstrating signs of radicalization, people recognize it so that they can provide the kind of off-ramp and intervention that can be helpful? I'm not suggesting that this is easy. We went through a lot of this discussion in international terrorism, and you certainly don't want to stigmatize people whenever they ask for help. But I think providing the kind of identification of the precise kind of behavior that is concerning could go a long way. And so I think that the Biden administration's plan that includes research and an understanding of the precise kind of mental health that is affiliated with committing acts of violence is very important, so that we don't say anybody who has depression or anxiety is therefore likely to become a mass shooter, because that's just not true. But looking for the kinds of behavioral triggers that might be associated with this kind of behavior is really important. And it isn't, let's lock them up. It's let's intervene and try to get them the help they need so that they don't get pushed to the edge of radicalization and commit one of these acts of violence.
One of the other areas you touch on is the question of social media. And this is fascinating because certainly, as you mentioned, in the international terrorism community, there's been a great deal of, I guess in the international counterterrorism community to be more correct, there's been a great deal of success in using social media to monitor, to intervene, to disrupt terrorist activity. It's been a very fruitful means of surveillance as well as a means of countering violent extremism and radicalization. The questions that surround that become more fraught when you move into the domestic context. And so you spoke of the concept of a duty of care for social media companies. And I'm curious what that would look like in your vision.
Yes, this is such an interesting space. And, we are going through some growing pains, I think, with social media. When it first appeared on the scene, I think we all thought this was great. Here's everybody gets to be a publisher. Times Person of the Year, gosh, probably more than a decade ago now, was you. Remember this? And like the cover photo was a mirror, and it talked about how YouTube and other social media platforms were enabling all of us to be publishers of content, and how this would be such a great tool in the future because we'll all be so smart and we'll all have the ability to shape policy. And, Arab Spring showed that the people can, this will be so great for democracy because the people will have a voice. And all of that is true. But now I feel like we're going through maybe the teenage years where we've seen that, I've learned bad words and now I'm going to abuse them all the time because I figured out how to use this in a way that can cause mischief, and more, and really serious damage, and can control, power structures, and can provide disinformation, and can become a force of threats or doxing and, sharing private information and getting people to gang up on others. And so there's a real danger of the way social media can be used and abused. So how do we rein that in? Well, one way would be this proposal we saw out of Texas recently that the Supreme Court recently enjoined, which said social media platforms may not regulate. They have to permit everything. They may not have community standards because the concern there is that they are censoring conservative viewpoints or something like that. The Elon Musk philosophy, complete unrestricted and free expression on the internet. Anybody can say whatever they want. I think that just opens the floodgates to sharing information on how to build bombs and ganging up on vulnerable people. And so I think that's perhaps a good faith effort that could be a disaster. The other possibility is to regulate social media and impose standards of care on them. And I don't know whether we could do that without running afoul of the First Amendment, telling them you must do this, you must do that, and providing, government imposed censorship, which could be difficult. And so what I propose is something that they have proposed in Great Britain. So none of my ideas, by the way, Doyle, are original. I just cherry pick from around the world where I see some best ideas. But I think that's how, you can end up with some good practices by adopting best practices from elsewhere. But Great Britain has this idea that in the same way we regulate television and radio, we create a duty of care to protect users from harm. And, you could regulate that with fines in the same way we regulate broadcast media and we regulate utilities. Social media seems to me maybe a blend of both of those things, in some ways a utility, in some ways kind of like broadcast media. And so if we had rules that were narrowly tailored to advance some compelling governmental interests of free expression tempered with public safety, we might be able to pass constitutional muster. As many of your listeners probably know, no right in the Constitution is absolute as long as there is a compelling governmental interest and the regulation is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest, then regulation is permissible. The old, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater idea.
You can't falsely yell fire in a crowded theater.
Yes, correct. That there is, some space for tempering all of these rights. And so this idea that there is a duty of care, and I think that blends well with what many of the social media companies already do with these community standards. I think it would simply impose on them a duty that if you see something where someone is being threatened, you must remove it. If you see something where, people are sharing information dangerous to human life, like let's all go to the gay pride event with guns on Friday and make sure that doesn't happen. It's a little tricky when you decide what does and doesn't constitute a breach of that duty of care. But I think it puts a little teeth behind what the social media companies are already doing. They of course want to say every time they appear for these hearings before Congress, trust us, we're doing our best, we are governing ourselves, you don't need to regulate us. And then they throw out just enough technical mumbo jumbo to get these octogenarian legislators confused into saying, I don't know what I'm talking about. Am I hashtagging right now? Like those progressive ads about becoming your parents, get them all turned around and they say, I don't even know where to begin. And they throw up their hands. But, we had that testimony from that whistleblower, Frances Hagins, I think was her name, Hoggins, who, talked about it isn't the content that Facebook is manipulating. It's the algorithms, right? They push all this hate stuff with their hate button, because that's what draws people, keeps people engaged on the platform and draws eyeballs to their ads and makes money. So if instead you say, well, you have a duty of care here, to avoid raising temperatures for the sake of eyeballs. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I think it is basically imposing these standards of care for community standards in a way that is content neutral, but prevents, it's viewpoint neutral. It isn't about pushing the left or the right, but it's about protecting the public. I think there's space for some regulation there. And, whether it's the FCC or the FTC who provides this regulation, I think that there is a role for government here as we advance past our teenage years and into our adult years in how we want to deal with social media in our lives. It doesn't have to be unregulated. It can be regulated consistent with the First Amendment.
So I guess I have a question because, phrases like duty of care, community standards give a sense of comfort in part because they imply some level of certainty. And yet, historically, when I take a look at important standards, especially as it regards free speech, there's a great deal of elasticity in them. And I think specifically to Schenck versus United States and the clear and present danger test, clear and present danger has become this catchphrase in contexts far removed from free speech by now. And yet not a lot of people look back and realize that the activity for which Schenck was convicted for posing a clear and present danger was distributing leaflets from a rooftop opposing the draft during World War I. And so I guess my question is, how much benefit does a standard like saying we have a duty of care, we have community standards, what does that actually buy us? Or is it still just so elastic that it's hard to pin down?
Yeah, I think you'd have to include a little more language than that. But I think this would be a matter for Congress to study and determine what do we want that language to be. And I think there would have to be some standards there that are a little more specific than that. You would need some guardrails. But I don't think you could legislate precisely, you can't say X or you must say Y. But I do think that you could talk about, people making statements that is specifically organizing a physical violent attack. Let's all go, kill so-and-so. Let's organize this. Let's go disrupt. The sharing of someone's private information publicly, I think, is something that could be regulated. Doyle Hodges lives at 123 Elm Street. Here's a picture of his home. Let's all go there, and locked and loaded. Some of those kinds of things. I think there are ways that we could provide some specifics that is elastic enough. And we do it all the time in the law, right? I mean, we have reasonableness. Tort liability is all based on duty of care and violation of, something a person is on notice that a reasonable person would know violates the standard of care. The law is full of this kind of language. And so I think that with some guardrails, we would get there. And then, of course, case law would develop to decide what does and does not pass muster consistent with our constitutional principles.
One of the other things that you call for is an issue that is a perennial topic and one that has a lot of attention, especially this week, is the question of increased gun regulation. And I'm curious how you see a political future for this, because this is a question that has a great deal of support among the American public, that gathers attention every time there is a highly publicized mass shooting. And unfortunately, I have to include the words highly publicized because we can't do it for every mass shooting because they're too common. But I'm curious what you see as the future of that, and whether adding the national security perspective of domestic terrorism might give legs to an effort that has otherwise foundered.
Yeah, I signed on to an amicus brief with law enforcement officials in this case pending before the Supreme Court right now called Bruen, about whether the state of New York violates the Second Amendment by requiring licenses to carry concealed weapons. I think there's a public safety and a national security argument to be made that would limit access to weapons of war. The Second Amendment has been contorted completely out of control in the Heller case to completely sever it from the well-regulated militia clause, and to interpret arms to include assault weapons in a way that, the framers of the Constitution never did. Even the Heller opinion itself, authored by Justice Scalia, says no one is suggesting by this decision that we must permit any person whatsoever to possess any gun whatsoever in any manner whatsoever for any purpose whatsoever. So there's certainly room for limitations even within the Second Amendment. And so I think the obstacle here is a political one that is driven in large part by the NRA and gun manufacturers. And certainly there are plenty of people who have strongly held views about gun rights. But, gun rights for the purpose of protecting oneself in one's home, or for the purpose of even carrying a licensed concealed weapon, or for the purpose of hunting, are all very different from the idea of carrying an assault weapon, which is designed simply to kill people, with high-capacity magazines, which are designed to kill people very quickly, by people who have mental health, who should be flagged, and by people who evaded the background check by buying their guns, as 22% of the public do, from gun shows, private users, or online. And so there's a lot of space there, I think, to regulate the kinds of incidents and opportunities that lead to these mass shootings and to terrorist attacks. The indictment against the Oath Keepers group that has been charged with seditious conspiracy on the Capitol on January 6th says that they had weapons, including assault weapons, stashed just outside the city limits of Washington, D.C. They went in without weapons because D.C. has strong gun laws. And so it prevented them from bringing their weapons in. But they were just waiting for the word that they, kind of made it past the first round, and it was time to bring in the weapons because they had, rendered it safe to do so. So I think there is room for that, and we should do that. And I wonder if we aren't perhaps in a political moment where we could do it. The Senate is now seriously engaging on some of these modest laws about red flag laws, and changing the rules from 18 to 21, at least, as the age where someone can buy an assault weapon. And so, sometimes we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And if we can make incremental changes, that could be a good thing. But I think that this is something that could very well be exploited by domestic terrorists. It's already exploited by international terrorists. We know that there is chatter among international terrorists about how easy it is to obtain high-powered weapons in the United States, and so we should exploit that vulnerability in our nation's laws. And so I think one example we saw of this is the state capitol in Michigan, where protesters showed up to protest COVID lockdown laws and brought assault weapons. Now, they didn't use them, but they menaced lawmakers who were on the floor in the state capitol of the legislature discussing the laws, while armed with assault weapons, gunmen stood in the balcony menacing them. I mean, nobody should have to go to work under those conditions. And so there are really some very modest, very reasonable efforts that could be made. I think, to ban assault weapons, just as we did in 1994, to ban high-capacity magazines, to have red flag laws, to do background checks before somebody purchases a weapon, and to close these loopholes on background checks. Those four things, I think, could go a long way toward limiting access to guns by people who pose a very real risk to public safety.
If we could drill down for just a moment on these militia groups that you mentioned, because I think it's very clear that these groups that self-identify as militias are very different from what Hamilton had in mind in Federalist 29. They're certainly not the National Guard. You identified these groups as posing a particular kind of threat. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you think should be done?
Yeah, these private paramilitary groups who get together and fire weapons and train and put little patches on themselves, calling themselves whatever they want to call themselves, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, whatever it is, have, latched on to certain phrases as cover by calling themselves militia. They read the Second Amendment like, oh, militia. If I call myself a militia, then I can do whatever I want with a gun. They're not militias. They are private paramilitary groups. Militias are groups controlled by the government for the purpose of defending the United States government. These groups are there to oppose the United States government. They call themselves, patriots. There's a group called the 3 Percenters. They say that they are patriots designed to protect Americans from government tyranny. They are the opposite of the kind of militia that was described in the Constitution. And most states, in fact, all 50 states, prohibit private militia activity in some way, and 25 states actually make it a criminal offense. But we've become so skittish about anything having to do with the rights to assembly and the rights to possess guns that we have completely shied away from enforcing these laws. And so I think that we should be very aggressive in enforcing them. The idea that you are doing military-style drilling and training and wearing uniforms to scenes of civil unrest is incredibly dangerous. On January 6th, there were police officers who said, I couldn't tell who was us and who was them. They showed up in riot gear. They had helmets and uniforms and patches. We didn't know who was the police and who were the enemy. In the same way, just the prior June in the George Floyd protests, we had groups who ultimately we learned came from the Bureau of Prisons, but they came in unlabeled black, crowd control gear with helmets and shields and guns. They looked exactly the same as the people who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th. It's incredibly dangerous when we have these kinds of groups showing up at scenes of civil unrest, blending in with police officers. And so there are laws already on the books that could prohibit the drilling and training in military tactics by private paramilitary groups. And I think we need to stop shying away from enforcing these laws.
So you mentioned the January 6th insurrection, and the final recommendation in your article, I think, is especially salient and powerful this week as we watch and listen to the work of the January 6th Investigation Committee, which is to hold divisive politicians accountable. And I'm curious what you see as the best mechanism for doing that.
Yeah, and again, I think because of our First Amendment rights that we hold dear and we should, we have allowed politicians to get away with using rhetoric that goes beyond the fiery. I mean, for generations, politicians have talked about, we're going to fight for your rights. I fight for you. I think it must poll well because they all talk about it. That's not what I'm talking about. Certainly people are entitled to that kind of thing. And when it comes to in the first order, people like Donald Trump saying we're going to march down to the Capitol, knowing that he's inciting the crowd. At the very least, we need to hold politicians accountable politically. We must say that we will not tolerate politicians who stoke violence and who tell people to go to the private homes of public officials like election officials and public health officials during COVID to fight for your rights and inspire violence. Politically, we get the leaders we deserve. And by tolerating this kind of rhetoric, we have created these monsters. So in the very first, I call on our fellow citizens to hold accountable our leaders by voting them out of office and not electing people who are so irresponsible in their rhetoric to unleash those who are just waiting for the fire, for the fuse to be lit. As Liz Cheney said the other day, Donald Trump assembled the mob, and then lit the fuse that caused this attack. And then when it comes to charging people with crimes, I don't know what all the evidence is, and certainly the criminal charges require sufficient evidence to prove crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. But it seems to me that there is certainly sufficient evidence to begin an investigation that Donald Trump engaged in criminal behavior when he said things so irresponsible when he knew they were false. Saying things like, this election was stolen and you need to fight or you won't have a country anymore. When he did that on the basis that, based on the evidence we saw in the second day of the hearings of the January 6th committee, he was told again and again by his insiders, his trusted advisors, his campaign officials, his data technologists, his own attorney general, that there was absolutely no fraud in the election, that they've investigated all of these claims and found them all to be baseless, that they'd all been debunked, and continued to persist in these false claims and fire up the crowd, that there must be criminal consequences if the evidence is there to show either a conspiracy to defraud the United States by pushing theories he knew to be false, a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding by pushing Mike Pence to stop that vote count when he knew it was false. All of those things, I think, are worthy of investigation. And if the evidence is there, criminal charges against President Trump for doing so much damage to our political institutions.
So I'm curious, a lot of Americans have a tendency to like sort of legal solutions that take the responsibility for fixing something from them and place it on the lawmakers. Term limits are one example. There's been discussion recently of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars from office anyone who has participated in insurrection against the United States government. I'm curious whether you see that as a viable option or whether you see that as something fraught with peril, or both.
Both. I think it's worth a try. I think one challenge with that provision is it's quite vague. It's a little unclear as to, number one, what finding and by whom must be made that this person engaged in this, and by what standard. And so for that reason, I could imagine that someone who tried to hold someone accountable, as they're doing in Georgia and North Carolina with Marjorie Taylor Greene and with
Madison Cawthorn, I believe.
Madison Cawthorn, thank you. Yeah. See how quickly we forget. The state Secretary of State trying to keep them off the ballot on that basis. And that is one way to enforce that. And I think it has led and will continue to lead to legal challenges, which could help us interpret the law there and identify exactly how it is to be enforced. But I could also see those legal challenges succeeding, that it's too vague. It says provides this very general concept, but it never specifies exactly how it's supposed to work. So there could be some constitutional problems with that. So I think it's worth a try. But as you say, I don't know that it's the only way. Perhaps we need citizens to take responsibility for citizenship and say, I'm not going to elect somebody who engaged in insurrection against our country. They're a traitor. They are not worthy of the office. And so I think there are two prongs by which we could go after that. And I also think potentially, I don't know what their involvement was, but it appears that there may be at least some members of Congress who have some criminal culpability here. I know that there have been subpoenas for some of them. I think that's worthy of investigation, whether anybody was on the inside prepared to stop the certification on the basis of fraudulent claims of election fraud. So I think, both. I think it's if we never enforce that provision in the Constitution, we will never know its validity, and it's essentially been rendered moot. And I don't think we want to do that, to just completely surrender it. I think the thing to do instead is to challenge it, to invoke it, challenge it, and allow the case law to evolve to decide exactly what the parameters of that provision are.
So we're coming up on the end of our time, but I just wanted to ask if you have any final thoughts or wrap-ups that you'd like to offer to our listeners.
America is at a really interesting and dangerous crossroads. I don't think all is lost. I think this is a moment in our country where we have an opportunity to learn a lot about how people can exploit us for our very freedoms. We have a lot of freedoms in this country, and they're wonderful things. And I think there are people who will, in a very nefarious way, exploit those freedoms for personal advantage and political gain. And I think we have the tools at our disposal to protect our freedoms while also holding these people accountable. There are people who will talk about our civil liberties as if they are absolutes and cannot be compromised in any way, like our rights to free speech and liberty and due process and freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures and right to bear arms, as if they are in a vacuum. But in fact, as we know, the Constitution is to be interpreted as the entire document, including provisions that say unenumerated rights are left to the people and rights not claimed for Congress belong to the states. You have to interpret the whole document of the Constitution, which means that none of these rights are absolute. And so I think that we must, as citizens, elect responsible leaders who will be honest with us about the good and the bad parts of our government. We will get the leadership we deserve, and we need to inform ourselves so that we will not be exploited by those who are willing to do that.
And of course, that's a great call back to the title of your article, which is the wonderful quote from Justice Jackson in Terminiello versus Chicago, that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, in terms of the balancing of the fact that none of the rights are absolute nor intended to endanger public safety in the way in which it goes there. We've been privileged to be joined today by Professor Barbara McQuaid at the University of Michigan, former federal prosecutor and author of Not a Suicide Pact, Urgent Recommendations for Reducing Domestic Terrorism. You can find that in Volume 5, Issue 2 of Texas National Security Review. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation, and I think one that unfortunately is going to continue to be salient and urgent as the summer wears on.
Thanks so much, Doyle. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.